I was once mugged, and I am convinced that it was a setup. I moved to East Los Angeles the summer after high school. My parents bought the house from my aunt and uncle who had just moved out. We already had family in that area, so it felt familiar. The neighborhood was nice and quiet. The plan was for me to live with my parents and save money while I figured out what I wanted next. I was getting ready to start community college and applied to a medical assistant program. Back then, everyone had an opinion about East LA. People loved to describe it as dangerous, even though most of them had never been there. I grew up visiting my cousins in that same area, and it was never as dramatic as people made it sound. These places are not scary to me. They're just neighborhoods where people live. I met Michael at my cousin's house party that summer. He had tattoos and looked edgy. When he asked me out, I said yes. I was flattered and curious what he would be like. He told me he knew a place with the best guava nectar in town and that we could go to a drive-in movie afterward. I actually laughed. I like guava nectar, but I had never heard anyone hype it up like that. But like I said, I was curious and I agreed. He parked at the drive-in first, and he said we could leave the car there, walk to the restaurant, and come back for the movie. We even asked the employees if that was okay, and they said yes, as long as we paid a small fee, which he did. Something about that plan felt strange. The restaurant was about a 20-minute walk away, and the movie started at 9 p.m. It was close to 8. I asked him if it was smart to walk by ourselves so late. He smiled and said he thought I was not afraid of neighborhoods like this since I had spent so much time in East LA. He said it like a challenge. I remembered mentioning that earlier, and he used my own words to keep me from saying no, so I went along with it. Very few people were on the street, and it was dark. As we got closer to the restaurant, he stopped a few times to show me videos on his phone. There were silly clips that he thought were funny. I was uneasy about the walk. It felt like Michael wanted it to last longer than it should have. Something was off. And looking back, I think Michael was stalling. Then a car pulled up beside us. A masked man got out and walked towards us. For a second, I thought it might be a prank like for a YouTube video. Then I heard his voice, and he said, "I need your phone and wallet." I remember thinking he sounded young, maybe high school age. He also sounded nervous and out of breath. I can't prove this, but I could tell this was not something he had done before. This was the only time I'd ever been mugged, and I don't know what other muggers sound like, but I just know that guy had never done it before. I think he was hesitating. At one point, I even remember the driver yelled, "Hurry up, man." He yelled back, "I am hurrying, bro. She's right here." He kept looking at Michael. Michael looked back, and I could not see their faces. But something in that moment told me they knew each other. He took my wallet and phone, then ran back to the car, and they drove away. Michael stood still. He did not help, but to be fair, I don't know what he could have done. You never know what someone with a gun might do if you make the wrong move. I was in shock, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I told Michael we should go to the police. He kept insisting we should still get guava nectar so I could calm down. I had just been robbed, and he was offering me juice. I had no phone and no way to call anyone. And somehow we were still walking to get guava nectar. We got the nectar and then walked back. When we finally got to the car, I told him again that I wanted to go to the police. This time, I said that if he refused, I would ask somebody else in the parking lots to call. He finally said okay. At the station, we gave our statements and it got even stranger. I said the car was gray because I knew what I saw. Michael said it was white. I said there had been a driver who yelled, "Hurry up, man." And Michael said there was no driver, that it was the same person who got back into the driver's seat of the car and drove himself off. He kept adding little changes. The officers were polite, but I could feel their patience thinning. When they realized we were giving them two different stories, one of them sighed. She said she could not really investigate if two people who were both there could not agree on what happened. I knew right then, they're not going to investigate this any further. Michael drove me home. When my parents found out what had happened, they were furious. My mom told me never to talk to Michael again. She did not need to repeat herself. Thankfully, I did not lose much. My wallet was easy to replace, and I needed a new phone anyway. I have lived in East LA ever since that summer. 8 years later, I have never had another bad experience here. The more I think about that night, the more I'm convinced that Michael planned it. I can still remember how he stalled to give them more time to come and mug me. I can still remember how calm he stayed through all of it. I can still remember how he tried to give the police completely different information from what had really happened. No way that was all an accident. Since then, I've seen Michael a few times at different things. He always wants to make small talk and invite me to things. I keep my guard up and don't agree to anything. Creepy backyard man. Back in late 2023, I began seeing a man in my neighborhood walking his dog. I would see him in the morning when I went to work, maybe 2 to 3 times a week. He was an average looking guy, maybe in his 60s. I would see him again regularly when I came home. Since I worked an 8 to 5, I didn't think much of it, just assumed we had similar schedules. He always wore the same blue jacket, which I also didn't think much of because it looked like a rain or wind jacket, so I thought it was just what he threw on to walk the dog. He would stare a lot when he walked by, but again, assumed maybe he was a lonely guy. One day, I asked him if he had got the end of the year letter from the HOA, and he seemed confused. I repeated myself, and he said he hadn't received anything yet. Wrote this off as well because I assumed he was caught off guard. I had been seeing him daily for months, but we never spoke. He genuinely seemed shocked by me speaking to him. I told him to keep a lookout for it, and he just stared and went back to walking his golden retriever. I began seeing him even more after this. By Christmas, I was seeing him at least once a day, if not twice. I treated him like every other neighbor, and did a quick neighbor wave when I saw him walking his dog. In March, I separated from my husband. He moved out and took the dog. He owned him before I came along, so I understood. Since I was alone and sad, my mom stayed with me a while. She doesn't work, so she would be at my house during the day while I was gone. She noted the same guy always walking by. She noticed he always stared too, and that it was kind of odd. She waved hello to him a few times, but he never did anything but stare and walk his dog. She said since he walked the dog often, but also seemingly on a schedule, he could have early onset dementia, or maybe sick somehow, and using the dog walks as a way to get exercise. We agreed he was very odd but harmless. After a month or so, my mom went back to her house and I was living alone. One thing I loved about that house was the fact that the backyard butted up to a national park. Beyond my fence was trees and forest. After my husband and dog left, I would be sitting in the backyard and hear what sounded like footsteps. It was almost always late at night when I'd be sneaking out for a late night cig before bed. I was drinking a good amount at the time, so I figured 1, I was paranoid, 2, I was probably hearing raccoons or opossums in the woods, and 3, having the dog before would have scared off any critters. It didn't happen every night, far enough apart that I was able to write it off, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. My fence had horizontal planks rather than your more standard vertical style. There are gaps you could see through if you were right on it. I looked over the fence in the daylight for a sign of anyone back there. The National Forest kept firebreak cleared between the edge of the park and the back of homeowners' property, so it was difficult to tell if anyone had been there or not. Eventually, I started noticing lighters and cigarettes missing from the backyard. I would swear I had an almost full pack going to bed, but when I checked the next day, it would be half empty. I wrote this all off due to my heavy drinking. My cousins started coming over and helping me do some handiwork around the house on the weekends. The neighbor guy in the blue coat would walk his dog every day still, but he would now stop and watch my cousins from the sidewalk as they did work at the house. He would let the leash out for the dog to come up to them, but they didn't pet it because it smelled awful. I told them the theory that my mom said, that he was sick and weird and harmless, but they didn't agree. And the next time he let the dog into the driveway, my cousins told him to fuck off. From what they told me, he just stared at them for a while then walked off. From then, the man would still stare, but it was even creepier. When I would drive by, he would stop and watch me, as in physically turn his body to follow my car as I went by. I would wave as if it were any other neighbor, as I always did, and he didn't flinch. Around June, a friend of mine moved in. She was going through a divorce as well, and I was happy to have someone to hang out with after work. We had a lot of fun drinking and burning fires in the fire pit, and it began again, the sound of footsteps in the woods. We were both drunk, so we ran inside and laughed it off. This happened a handful of times over the next few months. I would hear things more often when I was alone. My roommate split her time, so she was never with me on the weekend. She had noted the creepy guy with his dog. He seemed to be walking his dog when I left for work at 7:30, and again when she was leaving work around 8:30. He would let his dog out to her daily, and she would pet the dog at first, but she stopped because the dog smelled so bad, and the man never spoke. He just stared. She started being creeped out too. She said he seemed friendly enough until she stopped petting his dog, and his stare shifted to being mean too. He began stopping to watch her drive as well. Then one day, I saw it. I saw him down out past the entrance of the neighborhood and at the tree line to the forest. He was clearly walking into the woods. That's when it clicked. Why he wore the same clothes every day? Why he seemed to be there with his dog every day we left the house? Why they smelled so bad? Why I was hearing things in the woods? I almost began to panic. Surely a man isn't living in the woods watching me. Surely this man hasn't been watching me through my fence for almost half a year at this point. The whole time this was happening, the house next door was empty. It was a rental, and the previous tenants left and it sat. I started thinking back and I began to see the man sometime after the previous tenants moved out. I tried best not to panic and started looking into trail cameras to film behind my fence. I told my roommate about the theory, and she said I sounded crazy at first. She jokingly started yelling out for him to go away and leave us alone. Then, we literally started hearing footsteps in the woods at that moment, and ran inside. Before I could even order a camera, they rented the house next door. It was just days after I told my roommate what I thought was going on. A family with a dog and 2 kids moved in. The last time I saw that man walking his dog was the morning the family moved in, because I came home from work to see the moving truck. When I introduced myself to the new neighbors, I asked about the woods behind their house. They didn't have a fence. I asked if they found anything back there and they said they did, but it was just random junk they threw out. I didn't say anything more. I contemplated telling them, but figured I would sound insane. I believe this man was living behind their house and watching me through my fence. I never had cameras in the backyard, so I can't say for certain if he ever crossed the fence. Since I never saw him again, I decided his cover was blown, and he moved on to watch other people. I stayed in that home until October 2025. Literally never saw the guy ever again after that day. They were waiting for us in the bushes. Thank God for hotboxing. This happened around 2016, and is still what I would call the scariest moment of my life. I was in my freshman year of university, and myself and a few friends decided it would be a lovely idea to travel just outside of the town, to this view on a hill which was a pretty popular spot for many students and locals. We were even more excited to hotbox our friend's car, get super stoned, and watch the sunset. For some context, I live in a pretty dangerous country where you do have to be pretty aware of your surroundings at all times. Even though it is a student town, it still had its fair share of robberies, muggings, and even the occasional act of violence, stabbing, or even murder. You do, however, get used to it once you're an adult, and if you have never experienced crime or true fear, you naively go around never expecting something sinister. The spot we went to did have a fair share of muggings and scares over the years for some, but we didn't even think twice. We pulled up when the sun still had about 30 to 45 minutes of visibility, and began the smoking session. Everything was going well, and we were cracking jokes and very happy with just getting through an intense week. I noticed no other cars around, and was pretty happy about it, as it didn't really feel comfortable smoking and hotboxing in a car in the presence of others. After gazing at the beautiful sun and talking to my best friend, I turned my head to the right to look out the passenger window, and that's when I saw them. 4 men, torn up outfits, crouched in the bushes no more than 20 feet away, staring and waiting like lions with their prey, just hoping for us to open those doors and get out of the car. What was even more terrifying was how focused they all seemed on us. I immediately shouted at my friend who was driving, "There's guys in the bushes waiting for us. Drive!" And he accelerated and drove off without a second's hesitation. When we were no more than 50 meters down the dirt road, I looked back and saw 2 men walking onto the road just staring as we jetted off. Of course, we were all quite shaken up when we got back home, and were just grateful we never left the car and noticed them when we did. Best case scenario was that they were going to mug us. I still to this day try to avoid thinking about the worst case and even recounted it to one of my friends who was there that day, and he agrees that those men had evil intentions by the look on their face and the reputation of gangsters and desperate people in our country. So, to the 4 men who were waiting for us, let's not meet again. Late night visitors. About 5 years ago, me and my family moved houses. We only moved a couple streets away from our previous house. Our new home was nice, but a bit of a fixer-upper. It needed a lot of work and it didn't have a burglar alarm, which was weird. Anyway, the very first night we have in the house, we're all asleep upstairs. It's me and my wife in our room, my daughter in her room, and my son in his. I get woken up by something walking into our room. It was my 4-year-old son, rubbing his eyes and saying he has been woken up by banging noises. I tell him to get into our bed. The bed is too small for me to fit in now, so I swap beds with him. I lie down in his bed, and after a few seconds, I hear the same banging noises that he had mentioned. I wasn't sure what it was, so I went to check. I walked out of my son's bedroom to go take the stairs down. At the top of the stairs is a window that if you look out and look down, you can see the side of our house. And beneath that window is a back door that goes straight into our kitchen. I look out to see if I can see anything that might be causing the noise. And that's when I see it. There are about 4 or 5 men casually dressed in ski masks and big coats all standing outside the side door. They have the lights of their phones all shining on our door, and one guy at the front of the group is yanking the door handle off the door, trying to break in. It takes me a second to comprehend what I'm looking at, and realize this isn't a dream. I don't know why I did this next thing, but this is how I handled it. I casually opened the window, poked my head out, and looked down at the 4 or 5 men trying to break in and said, "Excuse me guys, could you fuck off please?" I didn't even say it in an angry voice. I was quite calm, but the other weird thing was they just all immediately turned about and walked off, as if they had been waiting for a train and had just heard an announcement that the train was cancelled, and they just wandered away looking for alternative forms of transport. There was no urgency, no scrambling away. We rang the police straight away and didn't sleep at all that night. It freaked us out because this was the first day in our new home. I have to admit, I hated the house after that. I didn't feel safe and wanted to move back into our old home. The next day the police came and we got a burglar alarm and added new locks on the doors and the spotlight outside the front door. We found out that a gang had been going around and robbed a bunch of other houses nearby the same night. We checked the damage and the door handle was hanging on by a thread. They were probably seconds away from getting in. It still freaks me out that if my son hadn't woken me up, I wouldn't have slept in his bed, and I wouldn't have heard the banging, and I wouldn't have seen them outside my door and stopped them just in time. It's weird as well that they responded to me calmly telling them to fuck off. I scared away a serial stabber, but this story still does not have a happy ending. This happened around a decade ago, when I was your quintessential, angsty, weird little teenager, quite moody and angry at the world. Ironically, that is what ultimately saved me, but the guilt doesn't leave me. I have never fully shared this with anyone before. My family lived in one of the nicer neighborhoods of my city, and unfortunately, muggings weren't uncommon, though to my knowledge at the time, none had resulted in anyone's death. I wasn't really following the neighborhood news, or any news really. I could tell my mother was getting increasingly worried over the past few months, but I just didn't care enough to ask why. She kept reminding me to lock all the doors, travel in groups, not to talk to strangers, yada yada yada. The same spiel most parents give their kids, only I took insult about being lectured weekly about safety at 16. Our first fight about this happened when I was told I was not allowed to walk home from the train anymore. I was taking some extracurricular lessons at the center of the city, and rode the train to the end of the line where we lived, which was in no way remote. Our apartment building was about a 10-minute walk from the station, and I had been doing that distance since I was little. I could literally do it with my eyes closed. I usually walked around with my headphones on and my old and much beloved CD player in my bag, listening to something loud and grungy, feeling completely safe in my little bubble of melodious solitude. Lots of yelling and screaming. Lots of, "You still treat me like a child. You don't trust me. You are suffocating me. You are taking away my freedom. You're the world's worst mother ever. Drama. You get the idea. Eventually, we came to a compromise. As long as there was still light out, I could walk home. Otherwise, I'd give her a call and she would come pick me up. I was fine with that for the time. On that particular night, however, I was really, really angry. Don't ask me what about. I honestly don't remember the reason. I just remember the wrath. I wanted to scream bloody murder, and the feeling got even more exacerbated when I realized I had to call my mommy to pick me up. Nope, no way I was doing that. Didn't matter that it was raining. I wasn't a baby or made of sugar. I got out of the train, ignored the heavy rain, and marched straight home. On the outside, I must have looked like a normal 16-year-old listening to some music while hurrying home. But on the inside, I was preparing to crush my enemies, see them kneeling before me, and hear the lamentation of their women. The way from the station to my home was pretty well lit, except for one turn. Back then, there were unkept hedges on both sides of the corner, one in front of the abandoned lot, and no streetlights at all for about 100 feet. I approached the turn, completely oblivious of my surroundings, internally planning my revenge against a yet unidentified foe, when someone jumped out beside me from the bushes, wielding a large kitchen knife. Most of what follows, I remember in a blur. I don't remember what he looked like. It was dark and he was wearing a hood. I remember he smelled strongly of medicinal alcohol, but I honestly don't recall him saying anything. He probably didn't have enough time to anyway, because when he jumped out of the shadows, I was so startled, I dropped my Discman. And that was it. I saw red, and I completely lost it on the guy. All of the day's frustration pulled out of me, like a dam breaking, and I unleashed a torrent of swear words at him, most of which I made up on the spot. I completely ignored the knife, shoved him back hard, and kept screaming, "Are you fucking kidding me? Are you fucking kidding me right now?" Over and over, and bent over to pick up my shattered CD player. I don't know what he did, and to this day, I don't know why he didn't attack me when I was crouched down. But when I gathered all the pieces and I stood up, he was nowhere to be seen. Holding the pieces of my broken Discman and CD, I continued my march home, muttering a variation of, "Great, just great, that's just perfect. What else is going to happen today to make this day even shittier?" And occasionally turning around to yell another, "Fuck you, man," at the general direction of the guy. When I got home, I got straight into a fight with a furious mother for not calling her, and made sure not to mention what happened out of fear that it would give credence to her side. The gravity of it all hit me in the shower, after the adrenaline had subsided, and yet, I think I still cried more for my broken Discman than for realizing the danger I had put myself through, and what I had just survived. It all came crashing down on me 2 days later, when one of my neighbors was found stabbed in the lot behind the hedge where I was attacked. I didn't know her that well. We went to Sunday school together, but my family and hers were neighbors for years. I overheard my mother talking on the phone about the serial killer that was making his rounds around the most affluent parts of the city, and how this was the latest in a series of muggings and stabbings in the area. Uneasy stay in LA Airbnb. I read a lot of these, and thank you all for sharing your stories. I thought maybe I should share one I have. This was back in June 2019. I, 19F at the time, went to visit my best friend. We'll call her Kelly, at her college, UCSC. A few of our hometown friends tagged along, and we stayed in her apartment for a day until our bigger trip down to LA. Us and her college friends rented a minivan and drove 6 hours down to West Hollywood. There were 6 total of us girls, and it was all going really well. Going to Malibu Beach, breakfast at the Belvedere Hotel, hiking to the Hollywood sign. Our first 2 nights were joyful, as well as our last, until late in the night. Before I go on, I'd like to give some description to the Airbnb. It was in a sketchy area. There was a shed we weren't supposed to go in the backyard among overgrown plants. There was high chain link fencing surrounding the property, and you had to enter a padlock code at the driveway to get the key. It was 1 story, 3 bedrooms. There was a glass window front porch, and that's where we'd hang out a lot and smoke weed. The back porch was similar, but more beaten down. We kept both doors locked at all times and the driveway gate as well. It was on Virgil Avenue. I have the exact address, but I won't release that now. Our last night, Saturday, we were hanging out on the front porch. What was so weird and a foreshadow we didn't see is that while on the porch, we heard the padlock and chain jiggling around down at the gate. There was all brush, so we couldn't see, but I remember we all retreated inside for a little bit until we worked up the courage to go back out and finish the joint. A bunch of us went to bed early, figuring we had to be up early to drive back to SC. Some of them still needed to study for finals. I remember smoking and then heading back to bed around 11:30 p.m. My other friend, we'll call her Gabby, was the last to go to bed around 1:30 a.m., except for Kelly. She stayed awake talking to her crush on FaceTime. I was sleeping for a while until I was woken up by one of the girls in a frantic state. She was pleading with me to come out to the living room, that they think there's something in the house. I was honestly pissed at first that they couldn't figure it out themselves and that they'd woken me up. I didn't know yet the desperation of the situation. I walked out into the living room and everyone was there except one other, who was sleeping. From the living room you can't see the kitchen, and that's also where the bathroom is. I sat on the couch and they all, simultaneously, were trying to tell me what was going on in whispers. Again, I was annoyed, so I said, "If you really think there's something going on, why don't you call the cops?" And all of them told me to shh, and I shut up. It was for 5 seconds that I was quiet, and I heard movement in the kitchen, almost like putting something in the sink or moving cups around. My head dropped and I jumped off the couch so fast, in a manner I will never forget. I gathered all of the girls into one bedroom, went to wake up the last. She was so annoyed at me for waking her up. I had to be a little mean to get her the fuck up. And we took safety to the other bedroom. We put a chair against the door. Me and another girl stood by it just listening and guarding. At this point, we're a mix of fear pacing, crying, not being able to breathe, and going nonverbal. I was trembling. Kelly was on the phone with the cops. Me and the other door guarder were talking about what happened. She said Kelly was still on FaceTime and started hearing things going on in the bathroom, like drawers opening and our cosmetics being moved around. This was around 3 a.m. Kelly didn't remember me going to bed and thought it was me, so she called out my name twice. This woke Gabby up, and Gabby came out asking what was going on. This caused the other girls to come out and check it out. I remember one of the girls told me she heard spoons rattling and her voice was shaking. They thought it could be an animal, so they went by the open kitchen doorway and banged a water bottle against the frame and yelled to scare it off. But obviously, that did nothing. That's when they came and woke me. At this point, the cops are taking long, of course, and all the girls are feeling different, wild emotions. There was a huge window in the bedroom, and I just remember feeling so terrified that they'd climb in through there. The other door guard looked at me and whispered, "Wait, put your ear and listen." I heard footsteps. I wanted to scream, cry, throw up. I whispered that we weren't going to share this at that particular moment. The cops come, but are not allowed to enter without us letting them in. This causes another huge problem, and Kelly is fighting with the dispatcher on the phone. I'm asking if they could just come to the window, that we don't want to go out there. Eventually, the other door guard gains the courage and goes out to let the cops in. Well, I've had many experiences with cops. I live on a bad block, and this one I will remember. There were 2 females. You think that they'd understand our fear, but not in the slightest. They said they searched the home and saw nothing. They didn't ask questions, they weren't curious, they just wanted to leave. They kept glancing to the weed on the table, as if inferring it was all because we were high. Mind you, some of us weren't smokers, and those of us who were, it was like 11 p.m. Weed has never affected me nor anyone I know like this before. We asked them if they searched the backyard, that there was a rundown shed back there, and they were hesitant to do that for us. "Y'all didn't search that in the first place?" They leave, and Kelly looks at us and goes, "I don't know about y'all, but there's no way I'm sleeping here tonight, and I want to leave right now." We all immediately agreed. It was probably around 4 a.m. at this point. We pack up our stuff and leave for a 6-hour drive to SC. During the drive, the sun rises. I text my parents and Kelly is messaging the Airbnb host. When the host woke up, she was never helpful, and I honestly don't know much development on that. We were in California for 2 more days. I remember Gabby and I just hung out on the beach while the girls studied and took their finals, but it all felt so weird. It was the only thing we could think about, talk about, and at one point, Kelly broke down crying because she was holding her strength for so long, trying to be the dominant one. It was so sad to watch when we all just group hugged her. It didn't feel real, and our brains were just trying to come up with an explanation, trying to piece it all together and make sense of it. On the long ride back to SC, one of the girls was saying maybe it was something supernatural. That seems like such a far reach. Regardless of how big a fan of ghosts I am, the most sensible explanation is that a homeless person broke in and enjoyed going through the girls' belongings. Our noises and yells didn't scare them off because they were probably high. So often I think, what if we just went into the kitchen? But if there was someone there, what the fuck would we have done? And what if it was nothing? Just empty space? This event took up my life for a while. I was so strict on all the windows and doors being locked at night back at home, checking 3 times. I was pleading with my dad to get a new, updated alarm system. I put a bat under my bed. Honestly, all the stuff we, sadly, should already be doing. But that fear, that inability to fall asleep for months, I don't want that ever again. Thank you for reading. I don't know who or what was in that house, but this experience caused me to buy and always bring my portable door lock to Airbnbs with me. The Circus Next Door, and my rebuilding year. I consider most of 1996 to be a rebuilding year in my life. I was 25 years old, fresh out of a relationship that crashed and burned right before the wedding. So deep was the crater and widespread fallout that I had to move to a different state to avoid my to-be father-in-law's friends in law enforcement, who were making sure I spent time roadside with them at least 4 times in the first 2 months after it all ended. I started over in a new place with a lack of resources and connections that were going to make it hard to get back into shape before I turned 30. Still, I was free and beholden to no one but my creditors, so I had that going for me. I lived in my means and rented a townhouse on a long row of properties in a less than reputable part of town. I didn't have time to do a walkthrough before I moved in. In fact, I rented the place unseen based on the online ad. It was close to the job, which was great because someone trashed my car the week before I moved out, and I ended up driving a beat-up Dodge pickup that I bought with the last of my savings. Once settled, I was locked into the rental for 12 months, which oddly gave me a sense of permanence in my new surroundings, and helped me get to work on my new life and career in human capital management and training services. My unit was at the end of the block of 12, with 2 bedrooms up top, a master bath, and a half bath in the living area. It was not a massive space, but it felt empty for lack of any furniture. I slept on an inflatable mattress my first 3 months, and used folding chairs and a card table to eat and watch television. The block was a place where people were neither on their way up or back down. Young kids in their first home, recently divorced with kids, the downturned from society in one way or another. There were fights, domestic and otherwise, throughout the night. Drunken parties and birthday galas took over the block on weekends, but nobody ever interacted with other families for some reason. No one knew anyone else's name or business. At least that's what the cops told me the first time they stopped by to ask if I had heard or witnessed something going on the block. My immediate neighbors were just weird. Like a space monkey on your lawn inviting you to an anal probe kind of weird. It was a circus of 3. The short, wild-haired woman looked like an off-brand troll doll with big pink hair that defied logic and a malfunctioning soundboard that only shrieked when provoked. The tall, thin man looked like an average bald human might appear in an elongated funhouse mirror. I don't know how old they were, but they resembled old, well-worn furniture, like the contents of an elderly couple's storage locker, old and ready to be discarded. The troll lady and funhouse man were not fond of talking to neighbors, or anyone. They were troubled people. Their fights would bleed through the shared walls and get louder when talking outside. They knocked my only hanging art from the wall when one threw the other against the other side. Funhouse Man liked to take his morning coffee in the sunshine, standing behind a screen of his front door in tidy whities and an oversized flannel shirt. He was often the first person I'd encounter in the morning on my way to work, and he would stare off across the playground into the woods, as if in a trance, long before I left the townhouse and probably long after my truck took me away. The cops knew them by their real names. There had been a child living there, but he or she had been removed from the home. A frequent guest in their little David Lynch sitcom world was a guy named Chuck. So named because Troll Doll Lady would yell his name every 10 fucking minutes anytime he was in the house. Chuck was a long haul trucker who parked his sleeper rig across the street every couple of weeks. For some reason, he didn't shower inside, so Saturday mornings, he would often run the garden hose over the fenced-in area in the back to take a cold shower, which was a lovely sight the first time I didn't know what was going on. He sometimes walked out back to take a long beer piss in the runoff drain. His aversion to indoor plumbing was never explained to me, but I'm forever grateful I never walked out back to catch him popping a squat in the tree line. For about 6 months, I tolerated the noise, let the neighbors be the bad guys, and called the police when the fights went too loud for too long, or when they all got drunk and played their 80s punk records through the night and engaged in the song of their people howling at the moon. I got to a place where I was making enough money to buy real furniture or rent a better place. I still had a lease to honor, so I bought a sofa, a real bed, and a desk set for an office. It was still a minimalistic affair, but comfortable. The townhouse felt like my home for once, and suddenly, the intrusions from the neighbors were twice as annoying. One night, Troll Lady got into a fight with a pizza delivery driver who knocked on her door by mistake, but wouldn't give her the pizza. I only know this because the pizza and its box hit my front window at different spots. This shrieking pink-haired witch assaulted the driver, which led to a light show by police that rivaled a Mannheim Steamroller Christmas show. I was left to clean the pizza off the window and call the office to replace the window. They refused until the neighbors agreed to pay, so I enjoyed a cracked window for a month before the court accepted her guilty plea over the property damage. Her arrest was around the same time residents on our block and the next one over began reporting burglaries. I was asked by the police if I had any information or experienced anything odd other than the Three Greek Circus next door. I told them I did not. Fortunately, my work and social life were on the rebound. I met a girl and we hit it off, though we stayed far from my house during the early part of our relationship. So I began spending more time away from home, though I would often come home late to the neighbors in a loud state of either bliss or rage. During the day, maintenance worked to replace the insulation and update the HVAC systems along the attic spaces along the entire block. I didn't think much about it because the work was done while I was gone in the daytime, and I assumed the property managers would be coming into my place at some point to access my attic. Probably the last one, as they started on the far end from mine. Quickly, I lost track of the project. One night, I came home and something felt a little off. The front door was locked, the windows intact, and the back door secured. However, it felt and even smelled a little off. Sometimes I could smell the tobacco and weed upstairs when it filtered up and over the attic space, but I was sure someone had been there. I cleared the house in a short, quiet march, but found no one and nothing missing. My computer, 2 TVs, everything was intact. Except, I went to grab a beer from the fridge to calm my nerves, and found the 6-pack missing. I was sure I had 2 Scratch Patch stout packs from my last visit to Stewie's microbrew, and the loaf of bread seemed to be a little shorter than the morning before, by several slices. I couldn't be sure, but I thought I might be missing some other items as well. But I wasn't sure if that was just the growing anxiety over being robbed. I wondered if maintenance had been by to inspect the window or work in the attic, and helped themselves to a snack and drinks. It would explain the musty smell in my apartment, and given the people I knew who owned and managed the property, it would not surprise me if a couple of their day laborers took a load off for a bit. The smell was most present upstairs, but in my office, which was opposite of the neighbor's wall, so it wasn't lingering dank. It was clearly gym funk. I immediately assumed laborer because it made the most sense, so I didn't report it to police that night. The next morning, however, I discovered my medications missing from my cabinet. All of them. My Lexapro, my emergency anxiety meds, and my other bottles were gone. I checked the windows and doors again. Now, in a near panic, I called off work for the first time using a burglary as my excuse. I was the 7th house in 2 townhouse blocks to be hit in the past 2 weeks, the 5th in my block, and one of the 5 without signs of forced entry. The police wouldn't tell me much about the other incidents, and didn't seem to believe that I locked my doors until I reminded them who I lived next to. By that point, I really didn't want to live in that place anymore. It no longer felt like home. I was sharing it with something I felt lingered in the air around me. There was a feeling of dread, A sense of violation knowing there was someone out there who was inside of your life without your permission. Once removed, it felt like living in a house without walls, and there was a serial burglar in the neighborhood where cops traditionally left to work out its own problems and carry away the remains. A week after the break-in, a few things happened to fuck up my world even further. First, Troll Lady returned home, and because she was on house arrest, a welcome party brought out all of the freaks Friday night. Second, because I was a dumbass, I had to come home and pick up a few things I needed to spend the weekend with my new girlfriend. As she was already in the truck and we were to be on the highway out of town, there was no other choice but to bring her home with me. The lot, including my spaces, was filled with what looked like gridlock in a demolition derby, so I had to park a good distance away. Third, she insisted on seeing the inside of my townhouse and take a pee before hitting the road, so I had to introduce her to the freak show next door before even setting foot inside. Fourth, on the way up the walk to the front door, we encountered Funhouse Man in the open doorway, gatekeeper to the drunk damassery inside. He was wearing his morning apparel, briefs, and a long shirt, except with a can of Red Dog instead of coffee in his hand. Fifth, Funhouse Man looked at us coming up the walk and spoke to me for the first time in 7 months. "You tapped that?" I think he said, his wet mouth spitting the words and his dead eyes scoping my girl. I shifted to put myself between them on the sidewalk as we closed in on the door and fished my keys out of my pants. Funhouse Man panicked, letting out a squeal before diving inside and slamming the door. The party went silent instantly. Sixth, my girl was unnerved by this and lost all her thrill over being with me in that place. She walked inside my home and registered her immediate disapproval. She didn't even want to pee there. I remember making some excuses, saying it's a temporary thing and my first step to better living, but it was the beginning of the end for us, like she caught me cheating with Troll Doll Lady. Seventh, I didn't realize the party had spilled out onto the front lawn and in front of my townhouse until I opened the door to see Chuck, the trucker standing under my porch lamp looking drunk, stupid, and angry. He was joined by a few strangers who looked equal parts the same condition and also like I had just fired the lot of them from the sideshow. I stopped inside the screen door trying to think of anything to say, clever or otherwise. Chuck, the trucker, started the conversation. "You go at Kenny." "What?" "Shit for brains. I asked if you went after Kenny in his own home." Nothing like that happened, but I knew immediately that my reality was not shared by those gathered in front of my own home. "No, he said something. I got closer to hear. He squealed like a little girl and ran inside. End of story." I was okay at the end of the first 2 sentences, but my anger got the best of me by the start of the third, and it did little to calm the group which had swollen up to about a dozen people looking for blood or things to break. Chuck was not convinced by my answer and took a step forward to open my screen door. He put a hand on the knob and stopped. "You step out here, or I come in there." "Go take a shit in a tree, asshole. You're not coming in here, and I'm not bleeding over that weirdo friend of yours. You can go beat each other like you normally—" 8. The words stopped there because Chuck had punched a hole in my screen to get to my face. I fell back and accidentally tackled my now firmly ex-girlfriend. Fortunately, I didn't have much in the way of furniture to break on the way down. The only thing going for me at that moment was the miraculous arrival of police drawn by the parking fiasco and the noise. My face was broken, my newest ex had a bloody nose and a sprained shoulder, and I was out of a good $400 in deposits for a weekend that would never happen. In short order, a few important things happened. Chuck went to jail and the charges against him would become the least of his problems. The party turned into a story time where partygoers spun their best yarn about how I insulted, assaulted, beat, or raped Kenny the Funhouse Man. I was questioned about the encounter by police and spent time with an EMT who I totally failed to impress enough to get her number. I was let go as several of the partygoers were arrested for either public drunkenness, disorderly conduct, or outstanding warrants. I'm sure this warmed me to the neighbors and their friends. My weekend companion was rescued from it all by a friend who drove her out of my life forever. You would think 8 things in short order would be enough. I had to continue living next to these fuckers for at least 4 more months, and I was going to spend those months terrified by what they might do to my property while I was working or the burglars coming back. However, ninth, I woke the next morning to the neighbors cleaning up from the party. Glass, aluminum, plastic, and cardboard packed 2 full-sized bins. Credit where it's due. The fuckers recycled. From my what the fuck position in my bedroom window, I noticed 2 of the bottles stood out from the Keystone, Red Dog, and Milwaukee labels. They were the scratch brand labels from my 6-pack. Now, there was a chance that they were brought to the party by a guest with better taste in beer than friends, but that was too much of a coincidence. My brain presented a question I could not answer. Where is the attic access in this townhouse? I just assumed there was one somewhere, but never actually looked or came across it. So how did maintenance get into it? While totally unrelated to the beer bottle on a conscious level, my paranoia and cynical nature collaborated on a series of connections. As I looked around the house for a drop that I'd missed for months, my brain worked in its weird way to line up facts in such a way that would sound insane if I wrote it all out. I went upstairs. My office was where the funk smell had been most pungent. I looked around again and decided to check the closet. I didn't check it before because there was nothing in it. On the carpet, I noticed a light dusting of drywall and paint flecks. I assumed it was rubbing from the sliding door against the wall, but it concentrated on the side by the wall and not equally along the track. The closet only had hanging shelves on the interior side. Looking up, I expected to see an attic access port, but found a jagged square carved into the drywall ceiling. Maintenance was not exactly flip this shack quality, but I didn't think even they would use a box cutter to carve a hole in the ceiling, and none of them were skinny enough to fit through that. Funhouse Man was skinny enough to potentially weasel up and down. The scuff marks on the inside wall of the closet was pretty telling. It took a while for the police to make their way over in response to my non-emergency call, but it quickly gathered their interest when the first responding officer reported what everyone missed the first time they did a half-assed search of my home. 3 unmarked cars arrived after the initial squad car. My neighbors were uncharacteristically quiet once the first cruiser rolled up around noon. I offered a folding ladder, and the police looked up into the blistering hot attic. A hole had been cut through the insulation, and a spot in the corner wide enough for a small or slender person to fit through. I was questioned again downstairs for about an hour before I heard more voices upstairs than I remember going up there. Before I could ask, a familiar face appeared at my door. My landlord. Ahmed looked concerned and astonished, which was a new expression, and the third after his, "Can I take your money?" and his general resting, "fuck off" face. "What has happened?" he asked. "What's going on? Are you alright?" He walked into my home without invitation and up to me on my sofa. I asked him if he was there to fix my cracked window. Everything else happened without my direct involvement. I remained a guest in my own home for most of the days as police took photos and marched up and down my stairs. I learned that my assumption about the attic work was wrong. The workers had to access specific units to get around the firewalls between them. In fact, there were holes in the firewall that allowed workers to enter the roof in one unit and run the entire length of the building. It was a measure that saved time and footsteps, but was a violation of several laws and codes, meaning that Ahmed's life was about to become much more complicated and expensive. These gaps in the firewalls also allowed someone to drill a hole in their own ceiling and run the length of 11 other homes, walking on the same boards laid by the property owners that muffled their presence. Every single unit in that block had a hole similar to the one in my ceiling. Further, at one time, the building had been wired for cable through the roof, and holes that had been cut to fish cable into upstairs bedrooms had been plugged up years earlier during an upgrade. Some of the patches had been replaced with removable plugs, giving someone a clear view into various bedrooms. In the attic, police found a step stool with a rope tied to the top step. It was stashed in the corner of the roof over my next-door neighbor's unit. But that's not the weirdest thing. Though all evidence pointed to the main access point being the smaller bedroom in my neighbor's unit, police did not arrest Funhouse Man or Troll Doll Lady for the crime. Around 3 in the afternoon, police had recovered items stolen from their units along with various controlled substances. Troll Doll Lady was arrested for violating the terms of her bond. Funhouse Man was taken in for the drugs. I was shocked to see a third person, not Chuck, walked out of the townhouse in cuffs. I'd never met him before. He was rail thin, thinner than Funhouse Man by half. An old man's face in a young man's body with scars and bruises all over skin I've only ever seen on corpses, white and waxy. He was naked except for soiled basketball shorts. He literally recoiled as if allergic to outside air and sun, and had to be dragged shoeless to the cruiser. I don't know who that kid was, but I got the feeling he never left the townhouse. Ever. Maybe not even the attic. The thought that this skeletal creep was looking in on me and had access to my life makes me overly cautious these days. I have eyes everywhere in my home, and I take pains to inspect the smallest spaces in and around my property. I often wake in the night seeing that face peering at me through a window or from the dark. It's been a long time, and everyone I mentioned in this story by name is dead. I don't know about the kid though. I never got a name, and I was unable to find him in any police report. Maybe he doesn't really exist. Maybe he didn't show up on any records and is languishing in prison as John Doe. Or maybe he's out there lurking in some upper level of an apartment building, or hiding inside the basement or walls. I've rarely ever felt truly home since.